There is a big dichotomy that enterprise companies usually deal with. The backup strategy is usually at the service level, right? They take backups service by service, data source by data source, but then the recovery has to happen at the application level, right? There's a huge gap between how the backups are taken or the data is protected and how the recovery should happen. And that's what causes a ton of complications, and we're going to discuss that down the line in this session.
Welcome, everybody, to this Strive podcast on building multi-cloud recovery that actually works. My name is Chris Mierzwa. I'll be your host today, and I'm excited that we are joined by Akshay Joshi. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Akshay because you could be wondering who's going to talk to us about this incredible world of multi-cloud that, while we've been talking about for a very long time, we're specifically talking about the complexities that it adds in this current universe of trying to recover from cyber anomalies. And having that level of resilience takes somebody who's been through it. And Akshay has come to us from IBM, Amazon AWS, Microsoft, and came to Commvault via Clumio and the acquisition that was at the end of 2024. So he has a wealth of knowledge across all of the hyperscalers and, more importantly, on recovering across multiple hyperscalers. So Akshay, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a subject matter expert in this very complicated space, and hopefully we're going to dispel some of the question marks today, right?
Yeah, my pleasure, Chris. Glad to be part of this.
Yeah, you bet. Well, let's launch right into it. Again, given your background, you've spent pretty much your entire career in multi-cloud environments. You've seen all sides of it from every particular angle, right? What do you think the top gap is that organizations think their recovery capabilities are versus what actually happens when an anomaly presents itself? I think that's the divide, right? We're trying to hone in on.
Yeah, there is a big dichotomy that enterprise companies usually deal with, right? The backup strategy is usually at the service level, right? They take backups service by service, data source by data source, but then the recovery has to happen at the application level, right? There's a huge gap between how the backups are taken or the data is protected and how the recovery should happen. And that's what causes a ton of complications, and we're going to discuss that down the line in this session.
Here's my question, right, as we lead into this. We chat with a lot of clients you have over the years. They present their current documented plans, but unfortunately, and we see this, when an attack actually happens and those plans get actuated, they're clearly missing components, right? And I know this is a huge rabbit hole, but at a high level, why do you think there's such a separation, or what are the kind of the top issues as to what's on paper versus why it doesn't execute like the paper reads when they go to go into disaster recovery?
On paper, recovery is absolutely simple, Chris. You need to figure out three things, essentially, right? What timestamp or when do you want to go back to? And then what do you want to recover? And where do you want to recover it to? Now, as you peel the onions, you start seeing a ton of complexities, right? Your when can actually be spread across multiple data sources, and each data source can have a different recovery point, right? Aligning the recovery point across multiple services or application components would be super hard. It looks easy on paper, but then when you actually get to the brass tacks of it, it's highly complicated. And what is the second component that we want to talk about, right? So this is where, your entire application could be impacted, or just a small set of microservices or components may be impacted, right? So you need to first assess the impact radius. Otherwise, if you go in with a all or nothing recovery strategy, you'll end up spending a ton of money recovering your application, right? So TCO is a huge part of the recovery process as well. And finally, where? So this is a hard question because it depends on whether you want to re-architect the application layer or not. So if you recover it to a completely different destination, then you'll have to reconfigure the application to talk to the new set of components that your recovery strategy has created. So you'll sort of have to make that decision on whether you want to, recover to an entirely different destination, cross account and cross region and whatnot, or do you want to recover in place, right? So these are some of the decisions that you need to make. But again, while it looks really simple on paper, just three things, as you peel the onion, the complexities start to appear.
Yeah, and you have just opened the magical, Pandora's box here on this paradox in general. So you have conversations with infrastructure people are very different than having them with the DevOps people. And the
Yeah.
application development folks who have, and rightly so, enjoyed such rich, unique functions across the different hyperscalers. While there's, of course, probably proclivity you see toward, let's say, a particular one for an enterprise, they may have functions in another hyperscaler that don't exist in the other or are more uniquely fit for their application,
Mm-hmm.
exacerbating this problem because they're like, well, of course
Yeah.
I'm going to go use a little bit of this and a little bit of that because I need to
Yeah.
stitch together what it is that I'm doing. As long as I'm not shipping too much data or I'm not exposing
Mm-hmm.
myself to unique security,
Yeah.
the development folks want these multi-cloud strategies, but of course it applies an enormous amount of pressure on these poor operational folks
Yeah.
who are, watching this going, could I just get rid of the DevOps team and then my life would be easy, right? Maybe
Yeah.
I'd be on one. But that's not the case. So are you seeing that in the field? And, as we kind of talk about what happens when ransomware hits, what are those top few things that the operations and the DevOps people need to be kind of interlocked about because they all have to be on the same page, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So as the environment aperture increases, the vulnerabilities or the risk, the probability of risk also increases proportionately. That's what we usually see in the field, right? Let's take a few threat vectors. You talked about ransomware, but then there can be multiple threat vectors. A couple of examples that I can think of are account compromises, right? I mean, this could be ransomware or otherwise. Your accounts may get compromised, right? Now, if your environment is spread across multiple clouds, then you're naturally talking about more accounts that you need to deal with and protect, right? The aperture increases in that aspect, right? And then if you think about accidental deletion, if you have your application spread across multiple clouds, then the number of identities accessing the various components making up your application would be higher, right, than if you were using a single cloud, right? So you'll have to keep an eye on that as well. And then finally, rogue admins. If you have a multi-cloud environment, then chances are that there is a different admin team who's responsible for each cloud. So in that case, you need to sort of keep an eye on all the admins. What are they doing? And, when one or multiple of them go rogue, then you'll have to be ready for that scenario. So as you see here, regardless of the threat vector you talk about, there's always a higher risk when the environment aperture increases. So that's what we've usually seen in the field.
All right. Great points on how this can come about, what
Mm-hmm.
these different human operations groups, I'm going to call them that, need to do to kind of better themselves to be synchronized. But
Mm-hmm.
let's just kind of tee this up. When ransomware hits, when you see
Mm-hmm.
this occur, and you've seen this happen with multiple clients, what is the
Mm-hmm.
first domino that typically falls, right? Where, if you had to put something at the top of the breakdown pyramid, what sits at the top that usually fails? And, how do we help start at least a discussion in remediating that?
I mean, I've seen that teams usually go into a scrambling mode, right, when ransomware or any such attack hits. The first thing that they need to deal with at that point is they need to isolate the problem, right? So the larger your environment aperture, the harder it's going to be for you to isolate the problem. It could be a single application and a single component of that application, right? So how would you isolate that one piece of your entire application stack, right? So that becomes a huge problem. And then after that, you need to assess the impact radius, right? One of your accounts may be compromised via ransomware, but how big is going to be the impact, right? Are they going to attack the remaining accounts within your organization, or how do you plan for that, right? So that becomes a reality check at that point. And now your recovery strategy is going to get really complicated, right? When you start thinking about the future scenarios, right? But ultimately, it all goes back to the very first domino, which is isolating the problem and assessing the overall impact radius.
So, and I know that's another rabbit hole. So we're going to go down a little. I don't want to scare folks. This is only 15 to 20 minutes. We're not going for the 4-hour Lord of the Rings version here. But let's talk about that and go down the technical, rabbit hole just a little bit. So that said, when someone's looking at architecting a multi-cloud environment, or for that matter, may already have one instantiated, but maybe that architecture kind of evolved without as much strategic thinking as they wanted, just because they were moving quickly. What about dependency mapping? What type of things should they be looking at when they're designing an architecture, either from scratch, multi-cloud architecture from scratch, or kind of reconstituting one that needs a little buffing around the edges, if you will?
So applications are complicated. When you're building it, you won't care about the backup strategy or the recovery strategy at an application level. So you build it with the pieces that you think are the most essential for building your application the right way, right? Now, because of that, your application itself may be spanning across various services in every single cloud, or multiple clouds even, right? You can have certain pieces of the application in Azure, a few others in AWS, and the remaining in Google Cloud, right? In such a scenario, teams usually face two problems, right? One is fragmented ownership. You have a different engineering or DevOps team that's dealing with the Azure deployments, and then certain others, certain other teams dealing with your AWS deployments, and maybe a dedicated team that's dealing with Google Cloud. So this fragmented ownership means that when there is a event, for example, you'll have to sort of align resources across all of these teams. And we are talking about people here, not just processes. So people and processes, you need to align that across all of these organizations, and they have to work in unison like a well-oiled machine, right? Now, the second problem that it opens up is multiple vendors, right? You may be backing up your Azure data using Azure Backup. You may be backing up your AWS data with AWS Backup, and you may be backing up your Google Cloud data with some other tool, right? Now, first of all, you have different teams responsible for different areas of your application. And now, an added complexity is that there are different vendors protecting the different parts of your application. Right? And vendor consolidation becomes a key there. Now, all of this has to be thought through when you're designing the application itself, right? So that's why we say that you need to operationalize resilience. You need to think of it right from the beginning, right from the time that you start designing an application. You need to think about how to protect the data and how to recover that in case of an event.
Let's go for the last part first. Using discrete tools at the hyperscalers to make backups. Inherently, if you peel back everything, they don't do anything wrong, clearly, but they do not communicate with each other. And frankly, I don't know if we'll ever see that, right? Because these are all very discrete businesses that compete against one another, right, for DevOps time. And they don't have a responsibility to form some magical cross synchronization across their competitors to show an enterprise the unified way to restore. So, I mean, selfish plug, that's why people like us exist. And, we see this all the time. Back to kind of this human element from the design at the beginning. Some of this isn't new. Akshay, right? I mean, we've
Yeah.
been talking about application mapping dependency before hyperscalers even existed. And, and to be blunt, and I hope for those listening that people do have strong dependency mapping. But if you
Yeah.
don't, or it is something that has not been a priority, and would love your take on this, it needs to become one now. If it never was before hyperscalers were involved, this is the time to gain an enormous amount of discipline around that. And I know some folks are like, well, that's not an aha moment. But frankly, we've been talking about this for more than a decade, more than that,
Hmm.
frankly. I remember conversations 15 years ago about dependency mapping before any of these dreams existed, right?
Hmm.
So now it's just even more important that folks do that. So I
Absolutely.
wanted to kind of double down on that for all the listeners, first time listeners, long time watchers, whatever they say, but that be taken into consideration. And I think it's worth mentioning again.
Absolutely. The applications have only gotten more and more complicated over the years, right?
Yeah.
And I don't see that becoming simple anytime soon.
Right, right. We know which direction it's going. It's not going in the simple direction. Akshay, so this is the big one, or at least in my opinion, this is huge. You talked about the discrete tools each of the hyperscalers have, and we
Hmm.
know people are using them, but it's not enough. Can you dig into why that is? Why using the discrete hyperscaler tools are not going to position you appropriately when you really have an event, a cyber event?
Absolutely, Chris. That's a great question because there are two big problems that native backup tools in the cloud um, have, right? I mean, the first problem is that native backup tools in the cloud are specific to each cloud. Like your AWS backup cannot magically start backing up your Azure data or Google Cloud data. And same goes for Azure backup, right? They can't start backing up your AWS data or Google Cloud data. They're inherently not multi-cloud in nature. That's why the topic that we covered, that your application may actually be backed up by multiple vendors, holds true here as well. Even if you're
Right.
using cloud native tools, you may be facing this fragmented vendor problem in your data protection strategy, right? The second problem is that native backup tools are not fine tuned for your workload. They're mostly generic. They don't really help you with the scale and performance needs of your application, due to which both your RPO as well as RTO can suffer.
And of course, those terms, while very appropriate for kind of classic disaster recovery, I'll use the one we talk a lot here about a Commvault, that we have some,
Hmm.
mean time to clean recovery, right?
Hmm.
MTCR, which in the event of a cyber attack, to your point, I've got to get to some level of clean, some level.
Hmm.
And hopefully that
Hmm.
means restoring my core tier one or tier zero, depending on how you like to look at it, for all those
Yeah.
kernel developers out there. I've got to get those systems up and running and then worry about the next layers. And to your point, synchronizing that effort across disparate tools, even if they are
Yeah.
coming from the mighty hyperscalers, just isn't
Yeah.
enough, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not enough. Yeah.
yeah. So that said, I mean, what do we do? Everybody listening's like, okay, you got me on the edge. What is it? If I'm a CISO, if I'm an infrastructure leader, where do I start? What is it that I should be doing then if that's not enough when that magical, unfortunate time comes when I get hit?
Yeah, I mean that's a huge problem, right? Now, if you're a CISO, you're thinking, "Hey, what is that one thing that I need to do right now to fix my strategy?" Right? Again, not a one-off thing, but this is a discipline that you need to sort of build within your organization, right? You may want to start building applications based on how quickly you can recover from an event and not just based on how well you can protect your data.
That's a big nugget you just laid out. We're not saying, hey, DevOps needs to slice the penny of their time, 50% cool new code, 50% for, resilience. But I would say that right now, if you were to look at the slice of the penny of time DevOps spends on thinking about recovery, it's probably very, very small. And so I think, I'm not trying to read in too much. You tell me, we've got to at least widen that slice enough from the beginning that they're thinking about, if I'm going to be multi-cloud, I've got to build recovery in mind as I'm writing code. Correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Your resilience strategy, for example, doesn't solely depend on how well your data is protected, right? It's not just the RPO that matters. It's also the RTO. That's the second half or
Yeah.
the other side of the same coin, right? So
Yeah.
you need to be very wary of how well and how quickly you can recover from events, because that can essentially mean downtime for your customers.
Sure.
If you're a
Yeah.
Walmart or a Delta Airlines, for example, if your data is down, your customers cannot access your services. Forget about the
Right.
revenue impact. There's also reputation on the line here.
Yep. No, of course. And this dependency, back to what we chatted about a little bit ago on dependencies overall, and then of course what you just mentioned about, hey, what we're talking about, coding from the beginning and thinking about what it has to
Hmm.
be. It has to be a full weave together strategy. And I think you mentioned, hey, if you're the CISO, well, as you know, a lot of organizations, especially large ones, the CISO does not own the operational recovery,
Hmm.
right? Very
Hmm.
different
Hmm.
groups. So again, it comes
Yeah.
back to kind of a thread we've been pulling on here for the last 15 plus
Hmm.
minutes, which is communication,
Hmm.
documentation, and the
Hmm.
appropriate rigor around all of that from the beginning. Now, Akshay, it's bonus time. Okay, this is what was a daily double style for those that Jeopardy fans. So when you and I were prepping before this, one of the things, if we didn't mention AI, we would get dinged. They would probably take this video down. But in all seriousness, we do have to mention it because it is prevalent in everything going on. And automation, whether it was classic, even prior to the AI movement, and now clearly
Hmm.
automation driven by AI, is
Hmm.
exacerbating some of this. So, do you want to spend a
Yeah.
minute or two talking about what you're seeing as you see this automation being used and what that changes for everything we're talking about?
Yeah. I think agentic workflows are a huge thing in enterprise companies these days, right? Majority of the SaaS companies are building agentic workflows within their consoles so that customers can sort of, automate their tasks using an LLM, right? Now
Right.
the problem that they have to deal with, that these customers will have to deal with, is what level of control do you want to keep versus hand it off to an agent, right? That's the very first thing. Now, depending on the level of control that you give the agent, you'll also have to deal with runaway costs. Now, the agent is going around making decisions on how frequently you take backups, how long you retain them. Each of them, mind you, has a cost implication. So you'll have to figure that out before you decide to deploy agents in your workflows, right? And finally, I wanted to say that agents are also identities at the end of the day. So
Mm-hmm.
they have access to your data, your backed up data. Now, what level of permissions do you want to give those agents? So that's another thing that you need to consider before you sort of um, let the dogs
Let them
out.
loose in the wild, right? Yeah.
Let them loose
Right.
in the wild, let the dogs out, right?
Yeah, yeah. No,
Absolutely.
it's a great point. And frankly, you've just opened the door to probably another 30-minute discussion at a minimum. Maybe we do a follow-on that, which is, I mean, an entirely, well, both interesting, exciting, and a little bit scary area, but it doesn't matter. We can't avoid the discussion, right? Is what you're saying. Like this is, even
Absolutely.
if you're at the beginning of some type of AI journey, even if you're not far along the path and you're saying, hey, Akshay and Chris, that's not who we are yet. Most likely, even if you're not that yet, you will be there here in
Exactly.
2026 at some point, right? So it's on everybody's
Absolutely.
roadmap. Well, I would be remiss if I also didn't say you have put together and helped author a fantastic paper that is going to be out on our Readyverse site, and I do want to make a
Hmm.
mention of that. One,
Hmm.
for the paper. Two, head over to the readyverse.com site. If you have not been there, it is chock full of practitioner level and executive level material that hits on this multi-cloud discussion. We've got things on how are MCP servers affecting things. We keep it refreshed with the latest information on threat vectors, and it's just a wealth of knowledge. So specific to what we're talking about here in multi-cloud and well beyond, I encourage everybody go over to the readyverse.com site from Commvault and take a look. It's something we're proud of, and more importantly, trying to deliver very significant value to you as an enterprise CISO, CIO, practitioner, etc. So I thought I'd mention that. Akshay, thank you for the time. Thank you for all of the thought leadership, of course, here and everything you do internally from a product management perspective. The work you do and the team's work is critical to everything that we put out, and trying to help our clients make this human synchronization and technical synchronization happen, which we kind of discussed here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for having me, and always happy to help our customers.
You bet. Have a good day, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this Strive podcast on multi-cloud recovery and resilience. Have a great day.
Thank you. See ya.